Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Upkeep. Today we're going to be talking about another tiny leader deck, this one based on Angus MacKenzie. Now this deck has not been as heavily play-tested as my previous Ashling the Pilgrim one was. This is a real concept I've thrown together, and it's the idea of using Angus MacKenzie in a mill deck. With only 50 cards to have to mill in a tiny leader setup, it seems like mill could be a really viable strategy. I've only gotten to playtest this a couple times, so it is not optimized yet. I look forward to continuing to work on that and to see how this plays out in time. Also, this deck is not optimized in the sense that I have not gone out and bought any specific cards to put in this or traded for anything. This was purely based upon what I happen to have in my collection. There are some things that really would work well in this that I just simply don't have. But let's go ahead and get started so you can see the idea behind this. So first off, of course, we have our tiny leader, Angus MacKenzie. The idea with Angus MacKenzie is that he is a fog you can use on every turn. Now once you've cast him for his 3 mana, you need to continually leave those 3 mana open so that every single turn you can use those to make sure that the opponent does not attack you, or if the opponent does attack you, that nothing happens. The nice thing about this with some of the mill effects we have is the mill effects are either on artifacts or instants, so that you can leave that mana open, and then at the end of your opponent's turn, when they didn't end up attacking you anyway, perhaps, because if they didn't want to make you use your fog effect, you can now use that mana to punish them for it. So, once we have a fog effect, it means that we cannot die to creature damage, which now means we can start milling our opponent. Now the funny thing about this deck is this deck's worst enemy, basically, is in fact my Ashling the Pilgrim deck, because Angus's fog effect does no good against Ashling with all of the direct burn spells. So first off here we have our mill package. We have a large number of cards that are designed to help mill the opponent. And if you're not familiar with the term, milling simply means making the opponent take cards off of its library into the graveyard. Because of course, if your library goes empty and you're forced to draw a card, it's your turn to draw a card, you lose the game because you have no cards left. So we have a few sources of repeatable mill, and we have some instant and sorcery speed ones. So first off here we have Shriekgeist. Shriekgeist is a 1 and a blue for a 1/1 flyer, but whenever he does combat damage to a player, that player puts 2 cards of the library into his graveyard. He mills for 2. Great with the evasion, means there's a good chance of that flying getting through. We have Tombscour. Tombscour is a sorcery, just costs 1 blue. Target player puts the top 5 cards of the library into the graveyard. Again, we're only playing with 50 card decks, so that's 10% of the library there. Merfolk Mesmerist is a Merfolk wizard, 1 and a blue for a 1/2. And with this guy, you can pay blue and tap it to put the top 2 cards to make your opponent mill 2. Nice that it's reusable, nice that you don't have to attack with him. Vision Charm is an instant, costs 1 blue. Now it can do a number of different things. The main reason that you're going to be using this in this deck, however, is for the ability for opponent puts top 4 cards into their graveyard. There are some other things you can do if you needed to, though. It is it has multiple uses. So you can make an artifact phase out, which can, if you're not familiar with the phasing out concept, it was from a long time ago in Magic, and it was the idea of things that would go out of phase for a turn and then would come back into phase at your next upkeep. And when things go out of phase, they're not in exile, they're not on the battlefield, they're just sort of not there. And so it can actually be a way to protect an artifact that you have if someone tries to destroy it. You could actually cause it to phase out, and then it will phase back in. And you also have the ability to make all lands of one type. All lands of one type are basic lands until the end of turn. You're probably not going to be using that in this particular deck. Okay, we have Increasing Confusion. It's a sorcery. This is one of the main ways to do massive amounts of mill here. It is X in blue, and the target player mills X cards. It also has Flashback, also for X and blue, but now the player mills double the X. So if you get to the point, if you stabilize to the point with Angus that, say you get to where you have 10 mana on the board, you can cast this for 10, make them mill for 9, and then the very next turn, cast it again for 10, maybe 11 at this point, and make them mill for 18 or 20. So very easy, very quick to get lots of cards out of their library. Mind Sculpt, 1 in the blue sorcery, for make the opponent mill 7. I've also got Grind Clock here, and you'll see a few cards that are in here to help interact with Grind Clock. Grind Clock allows you, it's an artifact for 2, allows you to tap it to put a charge counter on it, and you can tap it to make a target opponent put the top X cards of their library into the graveyard, where X is the number of charge counters. So typically the idea, unless you're doing some shenanigans with it, which we'll have, is that you're going to try to bring this out. On first turn, you're immediately going to tap it to put a charge counter on it, and you're going to find the sweet spot, which maybe is 2 or 3 counters on it, and then start making the opponent continue to mill those out. But we have a few ways to get some extra counters on it and make things more interesting. We've also got Hedron Crab here. Is a 0/2 crab for 1, but he has landfall, and whenever a land comes into play under your control, the target opponent puts the top 3 cards into their graveyard. So it's a great way to essentially every turn get an extra 3 cards going into their graveyard. Sands of Delirium is basically a reusable increasing confusion. It's an artifact you bring out, and then you can pay X and tap it to have them put the top X cards into the graveyard. So just another way to get that effect of use all your mana to make them do stuff. Sands of Delirium also actually is a good use again of that 3 extra mana I was talking about, where you've left the mana open for Angus MacKenzie, and if they don't attack and force you to use the fog, you then use the sands to make them mill 3. One of the weakest milling engines in here, but I wanted one more, is Shriekhorn. Shriekhorn comes in, it only costs 1 to play, has 3 charge counters, and you tap it to make them mill 2, but you take a charge counter off. However, I do have some shenanigans in this deck that allow you to get more counters on it. So even if you don't get a chance to do that, it does mean it's 1 mana to make them mill 6 eventually, and that's still an efficient use of the mana when you compare it to some of those instants and sorceries. And the last magical piece of our mill package here is one of the few planeswalkers that can fit in a tiny leader deck, Jace Beleren. Jace actually can make your opponent draw cards, which can actually help in an odd way with the milling. Of course, you can use them to draw cards for you. But one of the most important things here is that you're going to play him out. You're going to use his +2 multiple times to make both of you draw cards. So you're drawing more, but you're making your opponent draw more as well, which is, again, slowly helping the mill. But you're trying to get Jace up to the 10 point so you can make them mill 20. And again, there's a few ways I have in here to even help increase his counters. So now we're going to move into some extra mana base. Because we're playing white, blue, green, that means we have access to a whole bunch of mana ramp, especially in the green, that will really help us be able to get those Sands of Delirium and the increasing confusions coming out with massive amounts of mill every turn. So of course we have the ubiquitous Birds of Paradise, 1 green, and makes any color of mana for us. We have an Elvish Mystic, 1/1 for a green that adds 1 green to the mana pool. We also have Fyndhorn Elves, which is the exact same beast. We have Rampant Growth. Rampant Growth is 1 in a green, lets you search your library for a basic land card, put it into play tapped. This also is good, again, if you have the Hedron Crab out, you can get a second landfall trigger. We have the Silver Mirror. We're going to have a few of these Mirror of this phase where they cost 2 colorless and then add a different color to your pool. They're 1/1s. This guy adds blue. We have the Gold Mirror who adds white. We have the Palladium Mirror, who actually costs 3, but then allows you to tap to add 2 colorless. And again, the point here is using him to get out those really big mill effects. We have Darksteel Ingot as a way to, again, help with the color fixing. Plus, it's indestructible, which is nice. Oh, and we have one more of the elf cycle of the original Llanowar Elves. One green for a 1/1 that adds green to your mana pool. Now, because we're playing blue, we've also got a little bit of a control package in here. So we've got a number of counter spells, and typically where you're going to use these is to help protect Angus, or to just protect against the big spells that are going to kill you. You're typically not that worried about stopping them bringing out a large creature because you have Angus to make sure that that creature can't hurt you. So first off, we have Turn Aside. It's 1 blue, counter target spell that targets a permanent you control. Again, you're using this to counter them from doing something to Angus. We have Confound, 1 in a blue, counter target spell that targets 1 or more creatures. Exact same idea, but Confound costs a little more but lets you draw a card. We have the Ubiquitous Counterspell, 2 blue to just counter a spell straight up. I've also thrown in a number of utility spells and utility effects throughout this. So the first off here is Split Decision. Split Decision is interesting because it's a Will of the Council spell, which means if you were actually playing this in multiplayer, there would really be a vote, and you get to choose, in this case, people are voting for whether a spell gets duplicated or a spell gets countered. Because this is going to be in a one-on-one game, if the vote is tied, you copy the spell. So what this really becomes in Tiny Leader is 1 in a blue to copy a spell. One of the best uses of this is the ability to copy one of our milling spells. So you cast the target opponent mills 7 and then you duplicate it. Now it's 14. Or even you save a couple mana back, you do a Increasing Confusion cast from the graveyard, so that it's a doubled effect. You save 2 mana back, and then you double it again with Split Decision. You can also use Split Decision to actually duplicate one of your opponent's spells, of course, and get a really interesting effect, steal something, duplicate something they did. You can even use Split Decision to counter a counter spell by duplicating the spell and then retargeting it. And when you do that, you actually retarget the counter spell to then counter Split Decision itself, and then the two fizzle. We have Dispersal Shield, which is counter target spell if its converted mana cost is less than or equal to the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control. The best part of this is, again, it's Tiny Leader. Nothing's going to have a converted mana cost of more than 3 unless it's an X spell, which means this essentially is another counter spell that's cheaper in Tiny Leader. So again, we've got a few more utility things in here. So we have Swiftfoot Boots, which of course is just a great hexproof and haste. One of the main reasons to bring this out and use it is to be able to put this on Angus the second you bring him out. Giving him hexproof so that he can't be targeted by your opponent's spells is great, and giving him haste so that if they do manage to kill him somehow, you have the ability to bring him back into play, give him haste immediately so that you can stop an attack on the very next turn. So we've also got Sylvan Library. This is a fairly expensive card compared to all the other cards in the deck. However, if you happen to have a copy, it can be really great in this deck. It allows you to filter your draws. Because when your draw phase, instead of drawing 1, you're going to draw 3. You decide what card you want to keep and what you want to put back. Now you get to put back any card you want out of your hand. So if you had 5 cards in your hand, if you played this on like turn 2 and you've got 4 cards in your hand maybe, on the next turn you draw 3, you can put any 2 back on top of the library. It does not have to be 2 of the 3 that you drew. So you can put away cards you don't want at the time. You can sort of keep this extra library, as it were, of cards using the top 2. You can also use this to good effect with things that make you shuffle your library, to put some cards on top, then force a shuffle, and now you don't have excess, and now you don't have to worry about that anymore. You also have the ability to keep those cards if you need to, and just lose some life. And this again can be great to do that final last blow. If you draw a couple of the cards, you draw 3 different mill cards that all cost 1 mana, and you're able to cast them all and just finish off the game. That can be great. So I have some other interesting things here. So for example, Thrumming Bird. Thrumming Bird is a 1/1 creature for 1 in the blue. It's flying. When it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. Proliferate means you choose any number of permanents on the battlefield with counters on them and can give them an extra counter. You're going to use this in a lot of cases. So you're going to want to take your Grind Clock, for example, and add an extra charge counter on it so that you'll start milling people for more. You're going to take your Shriekhorn and add extra time counters to it so that you can again keep using that effect turn after turn. You're going to potentially take your Jace and start adding extra loyalty counters to him. You can also look at things your opponents control, and if there are some sort of negative counter on them, you could actually increase those to actually help yourself out as well. We have Kiora's Follower. Kiora's Follower is a green and blue for a 2/2. It's a merfolk. It has the ability to tap to untap another target permanent. This is extremely useful, and it's such a useful effect because there's so many things you can do. So you can use it to untap Angus, for example, if you ended up wanting to attack with him for some reason, or if your opponent used a spell that would tap him so that you then can't use his ability to fog. Now you can untap him. You can also use Kiora's Follower to untap any of your milling artifacts and use them again. You can use Kiora's Follower to untap any of your lands, or to untap maybe the mirror that gives you 2 mana and now get 4 mana. So that it's so useful because you can tap anything. We also have another source of proliferate here. This is Contagion Clasp. The main purpose you have here is the pay 4 tap and proliferate, so that you get to add counters to everything. Again, if you have lots of things, if you have your Shriekhorn and your Grindclock and your Jace out, then this is just amazing. It also has this other ability that when you first bring it out, you get to put a -1/-1 counter on any target creature. And now when you're proliferating, you can be adding more -1 counters, so you can slowly kill something, even something huge. Now we're going to get into our lands. So the first off that I have here, I want to talk about quickly, is the Windswept Heath. Windswept Heath is, of course, a fetch land. You pay a life and you go find either a forest or a plains. One of the interesting effects here is that it does make you shuffle your library, which is actually extremely important, again, if you have the Sylvan Library up. Because with the Sylvan Library, you can decide to put 2 cards back on top that you really don't want at the moment, then use your Windswept Heath to actually shuffle those back in. We have Command Tower, which in this case, because we have a 3-color Tiny Leader, is amazing for us, makes all 3 colors. We have Evolving Wilds, which you can tap and sacrifice to go find any basic land, and again, makes you shuffle your library. Terramorphic Expanse is an exact copy of Evolving Wilds. It's the same card with a different name. And again, we're getting into where these happen to be the cards that I own. There are some other great mana fixers for this color combination that you may or may not own or want to acquire. If I wanted to go out and buy a number of other cards, I could here. So we have Selesnya Sanctuary, comes into play tapped. It also bounces a land back to your hand, but creates green and white when you tap it. We have Sejiri Refuge. Comes into play tapped, lets you gain a life, and makes white or blue for you. We have Seaside Citadel, which makes all 3 of our colors for us, but comes into play tapped. I have a Krosan Verge in here. Krosan Verge comes into play tapped. You tap it to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 and tap it to search your library for a forest and a plains, and put them both into play tapped. And then again, you shuffle your library. So in the early game, it's just being colorless mana for you, but later on, you can sacrifice it and bring 2 cards into play. Simic Guildgate, which makes our green or blue for us. We have Selesnya Guildgate, again, comes into play tapped, but makes the green or white. We have Azorius Guildgate, comes into play tapped, but makes our white or blue. Thornwood Falls, comes into play tapped, gains you a life, and makes green or blue. Blossoming Sands, also from Khans of Tarkir, green or white, but gains you a life. Tranquil Cove comes into play tapped, gains you a life, but makes white or blue. And then we've got our very small basic land package. We have 1, 2 islands, and we have 1 forest. We have 2 plains. Mostly those lands are there to be able to be fetched by the various fetch effects that exist in this deck. One thing that is interesting to note, if you didn't notice it beforehand, is that the only white card that is in this deck at the moment happens to be Angus MacKenzie himself. So all the planes, all the white colored mana out there is solely to be able to cast Angus. Once you have one white mana out, that's really all you need. Any amount of fetching is going to bring other things. Now there are some good white spells I should probably bring into this deck, but because I was focused on mana ramp, which became green, control, which became blue, and mill, which became blue and artifacts, it simply wasn't needed in the end. There's also a number of cards that are unfortunately a bit expensive, but that would be really good in this deck. There's a number of cards with transmute that would allow you to go searching up some of the artifacts and spells that you need. There's also some artifact search spells in blue that would be really great to have in here to be able to go and grab, very specifically the grind clock, for example. So hey, that's my deck tech at the moment. I'd love to hear your feedback on this, to see what you think would work in this deck and what not. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel to see my upcoming videos. And hey, don't forget your upkeep.